Hey, tonight we're diving into the real Wild West, not the Hollywood version with its heroic cowboys and dramatic showdowns, but the gritty, dangerous reality, where survival was never guaranteed. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, but trust me, there's a reason they called it wild. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like, or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is. There, love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why you might not survive even a single day in the untamed American frontier. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The good news: you're about to experience a legendary chapter of history firsthand. The bad news: your chances of survival just dropped dramatically. The first challenge hits you before you even open your eyes. The smell, not the earthy, pleasant aroma of nature you might expect, but something far more pungent: the stench of unwashed bodies, animal droppings, and what might possibly be raw sewage hanging heavy in the air. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Wild West. Most settlers considered a thorough wash a monthly luxury, and that's being generous. Some went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, you know, was precious out here, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when you needed it for drinking and cooking. As you drag yourself from your bed, which is likely just a straw-filled mattress crawling with bed bugs, you realize how every muscle in your body aches. Life in the 1870s frontier involved constant physical labor from dawn until dusk. There were no weekends off, no vacations, and certainly no ergonomic considerations. Whether you were a farmer, miner, or a ranch hand, your body was your primary tool, used until it broke down. You might think you work hard in your modern life, but frontier labor was something entirely different. Backbreaking work that left even the strongest people permanently hunched and arthritic by their 30s. Imagine spending 14 hours plowing fields, hauling water, chopping wood, or working deep underground in a mine shaft. No wonder the average lifespan was only about 35 years. Standing on the dusty floor, you notice the chill in the air. If it's winter, your cabin might be 20 degrees below freezing inside. If you had a fireplace, you'd have let it burn down overnight to save precious fuel. Good luck finding central heating or thermal underwear in this century. And if it's summer, well, get ready to sweat through every article of clothing you own. There was no escaping the elements in the Wild West. Speaking of clothing, forget comfort. Men typically owned maybe two sets of clothes: rough canvas or denim pants, and cotton shirts that chafed against the skin. Women wore multiple layers regardless of the temperature: chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses that dragged in the dirt. Everything was scratchy, ill-fitting, and rarely clean. Those fancy outfits you've seen in Western movies, pure fiction for the average person. Your stomach growls, reminding you it's time for breakfast. Hope you like beans, biscuits, and coffee possibly for every meal. The Wild West diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Meat, when available, was often preserved with salt or smoke because refrigeration didn't exist. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, you know, when your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was common among settlers. Despite being easily preventable with modern knowledge, you might think the coffee would at least be good. Cowboys always seem to have a pot brewing in the movies, but what you're served barely resembles what you'd recognize as coffee. It's typically boiled to within an inch of its life, bitter beyond belief, and might include crushed eggshells or even salt to reduce the bitterness. Still, the caffeine would help you face the day, so you drink it without complaint. Before heading outside, you might want to check your shoes for scorpions or snakes that could have sought shelter during the night. It wasn't uncommon for frontier folks to shake out their boots each morning, a habit born from painful experience. One wrong move, and you could be facing a venomous bite miles from any medical help. Stepping outside your cabin, you're immediately aware of how exposed you are. The vast landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, sure, but it was also unforgiving. Extreme weather could appear with little warning: blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or drought could all mean death for the unprepared. The sky might be clear now, but that could change in minutes. If you've settled in a frontier town, you might think civilization offers some protection. In some ways that's true, in others it just presents different dangers. Towns in the Wild West were hot beds of disease without proper sewage systems or understanding of germ theory. Illnesses spread rapidly through communities. Cholera, typhoid, smallextheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats. An outbreak could wipe out half a town in weeks. Speaking of towns, let's say you decide to visit one today. As you approach, you notice there's a distinct lack of the organized layout you might expect. Many Western towns grew haphazardly, with buildings constructed wherever convenient, often without proper planning or infrastructure. The streets aren't paved but are instead dirt tracks that transform into mud pits when it rains and dust bowls when it's dry. The smell hits you again stronger now. Horse manure is everywhere because horses are the main transportation. There are no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some towns, the accumulated waste could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas. Flies swarm around you, and you realize why disease spreads so easily here. As you walk down the main street, you pass the saloon, likely one of the busiest establishments in town. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, saloons weren't glamorous places with swinging doors and piano players. Most were crude one-room affairs with rough plank bars and basic furniture. The liquor served wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels, but raw alcohol, often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it extra kick. A single drink could blind you if you were unlucky. The saloon represents another deadly aspect of frontier life. Violence. These establishments were frequently sites of deadly confrontations, not because of formal duels or showdowns, but because of drunken arguments that escalated quickly. In a heavily armed society, the romanticized gunfights of Western movies were rare. Most violence was impulsive, messy, and over trivial matters. Speaking of being armed, you'll notice almost everyone carries a weapon of some kind, but not for the reasons you might think. While personal protection was certainly a factor, weapons were primarily tools for hunting, protection from wildlife, and sometimes for signaling the constant threat from bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes made going unarmed foolish, especially when traveling between settlements. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to surrender their firearms when entering town limits. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Clanton gang refused to comply with Tombstone's weapons ordinance. Despite what you've seen in movies, quick draw duels in the middle of the street were exceedingly rare. Most shootings were ambushes or happened during robberies. The skilled gunslinger facing off against an opponent at high noon is largely a Hollywood invention. Real frontier violence was typically sudden, chaotic, and lacked any sense of honor or fairness. As you continue your walk, you pass the local doctor's office. Medical care in the 1870s frontier would horrify you. Most doctors had little or no formal training. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia beyond whiskey or morphine, and sterilization was virtually unknown. Something as simple as an infected cut could lead to amputation or death. Common treatments included bloodletting, mercury compounds, arsenic, and other toxic substances that often did more harm than good. Women in childbirth faced mortality rates as high as 1 in 4 in remote areas. Dentistry involved extraction without anesthesia, using crude tools. Most people suffered from painful dental issues for years before finally losing their teeth. If you were injured or fell ill on the frontier, your survival often depended more on luck than medical intervention. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening due to infection. Broken bones might never heal properly, leaving frontier folk with chronic pain and disability. The famous phrase, "Only the strong survive," had literal meaning in the Wild West. Your stomach growls again, and you realize it's time for lunch. You head to the local restaurant, which is likely just an extension of someone's home, where meals are served for a fee. The food isn't any more varied than your breakfast. Meat is tough and often spoiled despite heavy smoking or salting. Vegetables, if available, are overcooked to mush. Food safety standards don't exist, so dysentery and food poisoning are common occurrences. Or while eating, you overhear conversations about recent Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, or the danger of traveling alone. While Native American violence against settlers was far less common than portrayed in popular culture, in fact, settlers and the U.S. military were far more likely to be the aggressors. The frontier was still a place of conflict. The systematic displacement of indigenous peoples created tensions that sometimes erupted into violence on both sides. As for outlaws, they were a genuine threat, particularly in remote areas. Law enforcement was sparse, with a single sheriff sometimes responsible for thousands of square miles. In many places, justice was handled through vigilante action rather than formal legal proceedings. Lynch mobs were common, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply if you were accused of horse theft or cattle rustling. You might find yourself hanging from a tree before sunset, regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. After lunch, you decide to visit the local general store to stock up on supplies. The prices shock you. Basic necessities cost far more on the frontier than back east. Due to the difficulty and expense of transportation, a simple can of peaches might cost the equivalent of $20 in today's money. Many settlers spent most of their income on essential supplies with little left over for comfort or luxury. The store offers another glimpse into frontier reality. The isolation mail delivery was infrequent, and unreliable newspapers might be weeks or months out of date. Information traveled slowly, and you might go years without news from family. Back east, many settlers never saw their relatives again. After moving west, the psychological toll of this isolation contributed to high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among frontier populations. As the afternoon wears on, you notice dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather on the frontier wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Without modern forecasting, storms arrived with little warning. Blizzards could strand travelers, leading to freezing deaths. Tornadoes destroyed entire communities with no emergency services to assist survivors. Flash floods washed away wagon trains. Droughts ruined crops and caused starvation. If you were lucky enough to have a proper home, it provided minimal protection. Most frontier dwellings were hastily constructed from whatever materials were available: sod houses on the plains, log cabins in forested regions, or simple wooden structures in towns. None were particularly effective against extreme weather. Winter temperatures inside could drop below freezing. Summer heat was often unbearable, especially in attics or upper floors where many people slept. As the storm approaches, you decide to head back to your cabin before it hits on the way. You pass a group of men heading to work at the local mine. Mining was one of the deadliest professions on the frontier. Underground cave-ins, toxic gas exposure, explosions from improperly handled blasting powder, and machinery accidents claimed countless lives. Miners also suffered from long-term health issues like black lung from coal dust or mercury poisoning from gold processing. Even if you avoided mining, few frontier occupations were safe. Farming involved dangerous equipment with no safety features. Ranching meant working with unpredictable animals weighing hundreds of pounds. Logging had one of the highest fatality rates of any profession. Whatever you did to make a living, your risk of serious injury or death was exponentially higher than in the modern world. You make it back to your cabin just as the rain begins to fall. The roof leaks in several places, and you place buckets to catch the water. This is a good opportunity to refill your drinking water, as clean water was scarce and precious. Many frontier settlers drank from the same sources used for washing and watering livestock, leading to waterborne illnesses that could quickly turn fatal. As you sit in your leaky cabin listening to the rain, you reflect on how different reality is from the romanticized version of the Wild West. There were no heroes or villains, just people struggling to survive in incredibly harsh conditions. The fact that anyone made it through is testament to human resilience and determination. Night falls early as you have no electricity. Candles and oil lamps provide minimal illumination, and you're careful with them. Fire was a constant danger in frontier homes. A single spark could mean losing everything. With no fire department to call for help, many towns burned to the ground at least once in their history. You prepare for bed, exhausted from just one day in the Wild West. Your muscles ache, your stomach is unsettled from the unfamiliar food, and your mind is overwhelmed by the constant vigilance required to stay alive. As you drift off to sleep, you wonder if you'll make it through tomorrow, or if you'll become just another statistic in the dangerous story of the American frontier. The wind howls outside your cabin, a haunting reminder of how small and vulnerable humans are against the vastness of the untamed wilderness. Tomorrow, if you're lucky enough to see it, will bring all these challenges again, along with new ones you haven't yet imagined. In the Wild West, survival was never guaranteed. It was earned day by day, hour by hour, through hardship. Most modern people can scarcely comprehend. The morning light filters through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from a restless sleep. Your body aches from the hard mattress, but there's no time to linger. The Wild West waits for no one. As you rise, you remember yesterday's harsh introduction to frontier life and wonder what new challenges today will bring. Let's say you decide to leave town today to travel across the frontier, whether you're heading to another settlement, joining a wagon train west, or simply exploring. Travel in the 1870s was an entirely different experience than what you're used to. The good news is that by this time, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the east and west coasts of America. The bad news, unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Most frontier folks traveled by Horse wagon, or simply on foot if you owned a horse, consider yourself. Fortunate horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them out of reach. For many settlers, a good horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Then you needed saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care, though veterinary care often meant shooting the animal if it broke a leg or developed certain illnesses. Riding itself was no pleasure. Cruise saddles in the 1870s weren't designed for comfort, but for function. Hours in the saddle left even experienced riders with blisters and aching muscles, and if your horse spooked at a snake or sudden noise, which happened frequently, you could easily be thrown, potentially suffering broken bones or worse, miles from any help. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Forget the romantic image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system beyond the slight give in wooden wheels, meaning you felt every rock, rut, and hole in the trail. The constant jarring caused wagon sickness similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous, and miserable roads, if they existed at all, were typically just dirt tracks carved by previous travelers. After rain, they became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle deep during dry periods. The dust was so thick you could barely breathe, or sea wagons frequently broke down with wheels cracking or axles snapping. Miles from the nearest settlement, let's say you decided to journey all the way to California or Oregon, you've joined a wagon train heading west on the famous Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the approximately 400,000 people who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that an average of 10-15 people died for every mile of the trail. Think about that, a grave every 350 feet or so. For 2,000 m, the trail was lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many without names, as families were forced to bury loved ones and continue their journey. Disease was the #1 killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. This horrible illness, caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluids so quickly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. There was no effective treatment available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever claimed countless lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple children during the journey. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often consisting of folk remedies that did little to help and sometimes made conditions worse. Crossing rivers presented another deadly challenge. Wagons weren't designed to float, but
pioneers had to.
By hour through hardship, most modern people can scarcely comprehend. The morning light filters through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from a restless sleep. Your body aches from the hard mattress, but there's no time to linger. The Wild West waits for no one. As you rise, you remember yesterday's harsh introduction to frontier life and wonder what new challenges today will bring. Let's say you decide to leave town today to travel across the frontier, whether you're heading to another settlement, joining a wagon train west, or simply exploring. Travel in the 1870s was an entirely different experience than what you're used to. The good news is that by this time the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the east and west coasts of America. The bad news, unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Most frontier folks traveled by horse wagon, or simply on foot if you owned a horse, consider yourself. Fortunate horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them out of reach. For many settlers, a good horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Then you needed saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care, though veterinary care often meant shooting the animal if it broke a leg or developed certain illnesses. Riding itself was no pleasure. Cruise saddles in the 1870s weren't designed for comfort, but for function. Hours in the saddle left even experienced riders with blisters and aching muscles, and if your horse spooked at a snake or sudden noise, which happened frequently, you could easily be thrown, potentially suffering broken bones or worse, miles from any help. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Forget the romantic image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system beyond the slight give in wooden wheels, meaning you felt every rock, rut, and hole in the trail. The Constant jarring caused wagon sickness similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous, and miserable roads, if they existed at all, were typically just dirt tracks carved by previous travelers after rain. They became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle-deep during dry periods. The dust was so thick you could barely breathe, or sea wagons frequently broke down with wheels cracking or axles snapping miles from the nearest settlement. Let's say you've decided to journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train heading west on the famous Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the approximately 400,000 people who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that an average of 10-15 people died for every mile of the trail. Think about that, a grave every 350 feet or so. For 2,000 m, the trail was lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many without names, as families were forced to bury loved ones and continue their journey. Disease was the #1 killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. This horrible illness, caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluids so quickly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner if there was no effective treatment available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever claimed countless lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple children during the journey. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often consisting of folk remedies that did little to help and sometimes made conditions worse. Crossing rivers presented another deadly challenge. Wagons weren't designed to float, but
Pioneers had to.
And early death. The mining industry of the 1870s had virtually no safety regulations or oversight. Mine owners prioritized profit over worker welfare, and injuries were considered an expected part of the job. Medical care for injured miners was minimal and often ineffective. A serious injury typically meant the end of a miner's career and livelihood, with no disability support or workers' compensation available for all these risks and hardships. What was the likely reward? Despite the mythology of the lucky prospector, the vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, most worked for large mining companies rather than independently earning $2 for a grueling 10 to 12-hour day. Studies suggest that storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes consistently made more money than the miners whose dreams sustained frontier mining towns. Speaking of mining towns, they were notoriously rough places. Imagine a community composed primarily of young single men engaged in dangerous work with few women, families, or civilizing institutions. Alcohol consumption was astronomical. The average mining camp resident consumed several times more alcohol than the typical American. Today, violence was commonplace, with fights, stabbings, and shootings occurring regularly. Sanitation in mining camps was typically abysmal, with minimal planning or infrastructure. Human waste and garbage accumulated in streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly in these conditions. During warm months, the stench could be overwhelming, and swarms of flies spread disease from waste to food. If you managed to find valuable ore, you faced the challenge of converting it to cash. Banking in the Wild West was primitive and often predatory. Many mining towns had no banks at all, forcing miners to carry gold dust, ore, or making them targets for theft. Some saloons and general stores offered to buy gold, but frequently at rates far below actual value, taking advantage of miners' limited options. Where banks did exist, they operated with minimal regulation or oversight. Bank failures were common, often wiping out customers' life savings without warning or recourse. Many bankers were little more than confidence men who established storefronts, collected deposits, and disappeared overnight with all the funds. Without federally backed currency, paper money was issued by individual banks, and its value fluctuated wildly depending on the bank's reputation. Counterfeit bills circulated widely, and even experienced merchants could be fooled by well-made fakes. The safest form of money was gold or silver coin, but carrying it made one a target for robbery. Perhaps after considering the dangers and disappointments of mining, you decide to try your hand at ranching instead. The cattle industry was booming in the 1870s, with demand for beef in eastern cities creating opportunities on the frontier. Surely this would be a healthier, more profitable venture. Ranching did indeed avoid some of the worst health hazards of mining, but it introduced its own unique dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required significant capital, land, livestock, equipment, and buildings all represented major investments. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt purchasing these necessities, betting their future on favorable weather and market conditions. Nature often had other plans. Droughts could wither grazing lands and dry up crucial water sources, forcing ranchers to either watch their cattle starve or sell at devastating losses. Harsh winters could kill entire herds, as happened in the infamous Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887, when up to 90% of cattle on northern ranges froze or starved to death during unusually severe weather. Disease could sweep through herds, wiping out a rancher's investment overnight. Texas fever, anthrax, and other infectious diseases had no effective treatments in the 1870s. Predators like wolves and cougars took a constant toll on livestock, particularly vulnerable calves. Poisonous plants, quicksand, and injuries further reduced herds. The iconic cattle drives, moving herds hundreds of miles to railroad shipping points, were not romantic adventures, but grueling, dangerous undertakings. Cowboys, not the glamorous figures of later films, but typically young, poorly paid laborers, worked 20-hour days during drives, catching brief naps in the saddle as they moved thousands of animals across difficult terrain. These drives faced constant threats. River crossings could turn deadly in minutes if animals panicked, creating deadly pileups that drowned cattle and cowboys alike. Stampedes, which could be triggered by something as simple as a lightning strike or a snapping twig, turned thousands of 1,500-pound animals into an unstoppable destructive force. Cowboys caught in stampedes were often trampled to death. The cowboy's life was far from the freedom portrayed in Western mythology. They typically earned about $30 per month for exhausting, dangerous work. Most were very young men, often teenagers from poor backgrounds with few other options. A significant percentage were Black, Mexican, or mixed-race individuals facing discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere. Their diet on the trail consisted mainly of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, with minimal fresh food. Medical care was limited to whatever the trail cook might know about. Folk remedies. Injuries common in such dangerous work often went untreated until they became life-threatening. Many cowboys died young from injuries, exposure, or violence. Perhaps ranching doesn't appeal after all. What about farming? Surely growing food, the most fundamental of human activities, would offer a more stable and less dangerous way of life on the frontier. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened vast areas of the West to settlement, offering 160 acres free to anyone who would live on and improve the land for 5 years. This seemed like an incredible opportunity, a chance for people with little money to become landowners and build independent livelihoods. The reality proved far more challenging than the promise. First, 160 acres might sound substantial, but in the arid regions that comprised much of the available land, it was often insufficient to support a family. Traditional Eastern farming methods failed in these environments where rainfall was a fraction of what pioneers were accustomed to. Many settlers had no knowledge of dry farming techniques needed for success in these regions. Starting a frontier farm required tremendous physical labor. The first task was building shelter, typically a sod house on the treeless plains, constructed by cutting and stacking dense prairie turf. These soddes were dark, damp dwellings that leaked when it rained, harbored insects and snakes, and crumbled without constant maintenance. Then came the backbreaking work of breaking the land for planting. Prairie sod, held together by dense grass roots that had developed over centuries, was extraordinarily difficult to plow. With the equipment available to most settlers, it could take a year or more just to prepare a few acres for planting. The work was so physically demanding that it permanently damaged many farmers' bodies. Once crops were planted, farmers faced threats from every direction. Drought could wither plants before harvest, torrential rains could wash away seedlings or flood fields, early frost could kill crops just before harvest. Grasshoppers descended in biblical swarms, consuming everything green in their path, and sometimes even eating the handles of tools left in fields. Disease affected frontier farmers as it did everyone else, but with particularly devastating consequences. With no hired help and little community support, a family's illness during crucial planting or harvesting periods could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Women often continued working the fields while heavily pregnant or just days after giving birth, risking their health because the work simply couldn't wait. Farm accidents were common and often fatal. Homemade tools broke and caused injuries. Animals panicked and trampled their handlers. Even successful harvests could turn deadly. Numerous farmers died when they fell into grain storage bins and suffocated in the loose grain. Or when poorly constructed storage buildings collapsed under the weight of their contents, the isolation of frontier farms took a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors might be miles away, visited only occasionally. Women in particular suffered from this isolation, some going months without speaking to anyone outside their immediate family. Depression, anxiety, and what was then called prairie madness affected many settlers, sometimes leading to abandonment of homesteads or suicide. For those who persevered through these challenges and actually produced crops, economic obstacles remained. Transportation to markets was difficult and expensive. Without refrigeration, perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved. Large agricultural corporations and railroad companies used their influence to keep crop prices low and transportation costs high, squeezing independent farmers from both directions. By the 1870s, another option was emerging on the frontier, working for wages in the growing towns and industries. Perhaps this offered a safer, more stable path than the high-risk ventures of mining, ranching, or farming. Wage labor did avoid some of the worst physical dangers and financial risks of independent enterprises, but introduced its own hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses or safety equipment, leading to frequent fatal falls. Railroad work was particularly dangerous. Track layers worked with minimal equipment under brutal conditions, suffering high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Chinese workers who built much of the transcontinental railroad were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. Working hours were long by modern standards, typically 10-12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Pay was low, with most workers barely earning subsistence wages. Child labor was common, with children as young as 8 or 9 working alongside adults in many industries, often suffering higher injury rates due to their size and inexperience. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay entirely. Those who complained or attempted to organize for better conditions faced blacklisting, being marked as troublemakers who no other employer in the region would hire. Company town settlements, where a single employer owned all housing and businesses, were common in mining and lumber regions. Workers in these communities paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company housing, and sometimes were paid in script, company currency, rather than legal tender. This created a form of debt bondage, where workers could never save enough to escape the system. Whether you mined, ranched, farmed, or worked for wages, frontier life shaped your experiences in ways modern people would find disorienting. Perhaps most striking was the relationship with time, not the carefully measured minutes and hours of our digital age, but a more fluid reality governed by daylight seasons and natural rhythms. Without electric lighting, most people woke at dawn and slept shortly after sunset, their active hours expanding and contracting with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in 8-hour shifts, but by tasks that needed completion. Fields plowed, cattle moved, or extracted during harvest or roundup. People might work from first light until well after dark for weeks without a break. During winter, many rural workers had periods of relative inactivity when fields lay dormant or cattle needed minimal tending. The concept of punctuality, so central to modern life, had limited relevance on the frontier. With few clocks and limited need for precise timing in most activities, people operated on approximate schedules. Stagecoaches and later trains introduced more precise times to the west, but outside these specific contexts, morning or after dinner were sufficiently specific time designations for most purposes. Entertainment and leisure looked nothing like their modern counterparts. After exhausting workdays, most frontier folks had little energy for complex activities. Conversation around the fire, storytelling, or simple card games were common evening pastimes. Music was popular when instruments and skilled players were available, with fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars providing accompaniment for social dances. Reading material was precious and often shared among entire communities. A single book might be read aloud to gatherings of neighbors or passed from family to family until it fell apart from use. Newspapers, when available, were read repeatedly, with every advertisement and notice scrutinized for information about the wider world. Organized sports existed, but in simpler forms than today. Baseball was gaining popularity, played with minimal equipment on Makeshift fields, horse racing, wrestling, and shooting competitions provided both entertainment and opportunities to demonstrate valuable skills. Children played games that required little or no equipment, tag, hide and seek, and variations of stickball that could be played with found objects. Holidays and community celebrations took on great importance as rare opportunities for socializing and recreation. 4th of July celebrations might draw people from miles around for picnics, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the year's most critical work. Religious holidays provided both spiritual meaning and welcome breaks from routine. As the day draws to a close, you find yourself reflecting on the relentless challenges of frontier life. Every aspect required harder work, involved greater risk, and offered fewer comforts than its modern equivalent. The people who survived and sometimes thrived in these conditions possessed qualities that modern society rarely demands: extraordinary physical endurance, practical skills applicable to countless emergencies, and psychological resilience in the face of constant hardship and loss. The darkness gathers once more, and with it comes a silence profound enough to hear your own heartbeat. No car engines, no air conditioners, no electronic hums, just the whisper of wind, the chorus of insects, and the occasional call of nightbirds. This profound quiet, so alien to modern ears, was the soundtrack of frontier nights. Sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling in its emptiness. As you drift toward sleep, you wonder if you would have had what it took to survive here, not just for a day or a week, but for years and decades. The people who shaped the American West for better and worse were not the idealized heroes of later fiction, but complex individuals facing extraordinary challenges with the limited resources and knowledge of their time. Their story, stripped of romanticism, is one of human endurance against conditions that would break many of us today. The cool night air settles around you like a blanket, and the stars emerge in a display of brilliance impossible to see in our light-polluted modern world. This, at least, is one pure beauty the people of the frontier experience that few today can fully appreciate: the majestic sweep of the Milky Way across a truly dark sky, connecting them to the same cosmic panorama their ancestors had watched for countless generations. Morning arrives again in the wild West, and with it comes hunger, a constant companion on the frontier. Food in the 1870s West bore little resemblance to the varied, convenient diet you're accustomed to in the modern world. Let's explore what keeping yourself fed would actually entail in this harsh environment. The good news is that game was still relatively plentiful in even those with limited religious conviction often participated in church activities for the community connection they provided. Religious leaders, ministers, priests, or lay preachers frequently took on roles far beyond religious guidance, serving as teachers, dispute mediators, and community organizers. The establishment of community institutions marked important milestones in frontier development. Building a school, church, or meeting hall represented a commitment to permanent settlement rather than temporary exploitation. These institutions helped transform mining camps or trading posts into towns with collective identities and shared futures. The creation of local governments, rudimentary as they often were, similarly marked transitions from frontier chaos to established community. Frontier communities also developed distinctive forms of mutual aid and collective action necessary for survival in harsh conditions. Barn raisings and house raisings allowed families to complete large construction projects impossible for individual households. Harvest teams moved from farm to farm, ensuring crops were gathered before weather could destroy them. Spontaneous search parties formed when children went missing. These cooperative traditions reflected the practical reality that no individual or family could survive the frontier entirely through self-reliance. This community interdependence existed alongside the individualism that later became mythologized in frontier narratives. Both elements were necessary responses to frontier conditions: self-reliance for daily survival, community cooperation for challenges beyond individual capacity. The tension between these values shaped frontier culture and continues to influence American attitudes toward government, community, and individual responsibility. As another day in the Wild West draws to a close, you find yourself contemplating the mental and emotional resilience required to endure such conditions year after year. The people who populated the American frontier weren't superhuman. They suffered, struggled, and sometimes broke under the relentless pressure of their environment, but many adapted and persevered, developing skills and perspectives that allowed them to find meaning and even joy amid hardship. The darkness settles around you once more, bringing with it the profound silence of the pre-industrial night. The day's experiences have given you a glimpse into a world both familiar and utterly alien, a world where survival required constant vigilance, where comfort was rare and luxury almost non-existent, where death was an everyday companion rather than a distant stranger. As sleep approaches, you wonder about the people who chose this life, or had it thrust upon them by circumstance. What drove them west, what sustained them through blizzards, droughts, illness, and loss? What would they think of the world their struggles helped create, a world of abundance and security beyond anything they could have imagined, built on foundations they laid through exhausting labor and countless sacrifices? The questions follow you into dreams filled with endless prairies, towering mountains, and the faces of those who tamed the Wild West, not through romantic gunfights, but through the quiet heroism of daily persistence against overwhelming odds. Their story, stripped of Hollywood glamour and frontier mythology, stands as a testament to human adaptability and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Dawn breaks on what will be your final day in the Wild West. As the golden light spills across the landscape, you take a moment to appreciate the raw beauty that drew so many westward. Despite the dangers and hardships, the frontier was a place of stunning natural grandeur. Vast prairies rippling like oceans, mountains scraping the sky, canyons plunging into the earth's depths. This beauty at least wasn't a Hollywood invention, but even this relationship with the natural world differed profoundly from modern environmental perspectives. The frontier mentality viewed nature primarily as a resource to be conquered and exploited rather than preserved or protected. Timber was cut without consideration for regeneration. Game was hunted to the edge of extinction. In many regions, streams were diverted, polluted, or destroyed for mining operations with no thought for downstream consequences. The near extinction of the American bison buffalo stands as perhaps the starkest example of this exploitative approach. In the 1700s, an estimated 3,060 million bison roamed North America. By 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. This devastation wasn't simply the result of hunting for food or hides, though that played a part. It was also deliberate policy encouraged by the U.S. government as a way to deprive Plains Indian tribes of their primary resource, forcing them onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan, a key military leader in the Plains Indian Wars, reportedly stated, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not he actually spoke these exact words, they accurately reflect government policy of the era. The destruction of the buffalo herds was environmental warfare designed to break indigenous resistance by eliminating their way of life. For Native American nations across the West, the expansion of white settlement represented an apocalypse, not just physical displacement, but the collapse of economic systems, spiritual practices, and cultural identities tied to specific landscapes and resources. While early interactions sometimes involved trade and cooperation, by the 1870s, most indigenous groups faced stark choices: confinement on reservations, continued resistance against overwhelming odds, or cultural assimilation. The reservation system itself represented a form of cultural genocide. Native children were forcibly removed from families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man, as Captain Richard H. Pratt, founder of the Carroll Indian Industrial School, infamously stated. These children had their hair cut short, were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their religions, or maintaining their cultural identities. The intergenerational trauma from these policies continues to affect Native communities today. Armed resistance against American expansion almost invariably ended in defeat, though some groups maintained independence longer than others. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where combined Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, represented one of the last major indigenous victories. The subsequent military campaigns against these tribes were marked by increasing brutality, including attacks on villages and the killing of women and children. The tragedy of this cultural collision was heightened by the fact that many Native nations had sophisticated agricultural systems, complex governance structures, and rich cultural traditions that could have offered valuable knowledge to European settlers. The different approaches to land use and ownership created fundamental misunderstandings. Many Native groups couldn't conceive of owning land any more than one could own the air or Stars making treaty negotiations over territory fundamentally problematic from the start. These cultural conflicts extended beyond native white relations. The West was extraordinarily diverse, with communities from around the world bringing different languages, religions, customs, and approaches to frontier life. This diversity was both a strength, introducing varied skills and perspectives, and a source of tension in communities struggling with scarce resources and limited infrastructure. Chinese immigrants who played crucial roles in building the Transcontinental Railroad and developing mining operations faced particularly severe discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major American law restricting immigration based on nationality, grew from anti-Chinese sentiment that had festered for decades. In Western territories, Chinese miners were frequently driven from productive claims through violence or unjust application of foreign miners' taxes. Chinese communities in frontier towns often faced riots and mass expulsions when economic conditions deteriorated. Mexicanamines, many of whom had become U.S. citizens through territorial acquisition rather than immigration, similarly faced discrimination and displacement despite treaty guarantees protecting property rights. Following the Mexican-American War, many Mexican landowners saw their holdings taken through legal manipulation, intimidation, or outright fraud. Spanish-derived water rights systems that had functioned effectively for generations were replaced with English common law approaches less suited to arid environments. Even European immigrants found that national and religious identities continued to matter on the frontier. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants, Eastern European Jews, each group tended to establish distinct communities and maintained cultural practices from their homelands. These communities provided mutual support, but sometimes became targets for nivist sentiment when economic or social tensions arose. Africanamines who moved west after the Civil War hoped to find freedom from Southern oppression, but often encountered different forms of discrimination. Black cowboys, who made up approximately 25% of the workforce on some cattle operations, rarely received recognition in contemporary cans or later mythology. Black homesteaders established communities in several Western territories, but frequently faced organized resistance from white neighbors and discriminatory application of homestead laws. The collision of these diverse groups, each with their own values, practices, and expectations, created frontier communities far more complex and conflict-ridden than later romantic depictions would suggest. The melting pot metaphor, popularized in later American mythology, obscured both the persistent cultural distinctiveness of various groups and the power imbalances that determined whose cultures would be preserved and whose would be suppressed. As the day progresses, you find yourself in a frontier town undergoing rapid transformation, a transition happening across the West during the 1870s and 1880s. The initial phase of settlement, characterized by individual prospectors, independent farmers, and small-scale enterprises, was giving way to more organized corporate development of Western resources. The arrival of railroads catalyzed this transition. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, dramatically reduced travel time between East and West from months to days. Subsequent branch lines penetrated previously isolated regions, connecting them to national markets and supply chains. This transportation revolution allowed large-scale extraction of Western resources for Eastern factories and enabled mass-produced Eastern goods to flood Western markets. These economic connections accelerated the integration of Western regions into national systems, but often disadvantaged small producers. Independent miners couldn't compete with large mining corporations that brought industrial methods and capital investment. Family farms struggled against agricultural enterprises operating on vast acreage. Small ranchers found themselves squeezed by cattle companies with investor backing and political connections. Corporate interests increasingly dominated political as well as economic structures. Railroad companies, mining conglomerates, timber interests, and large landholders exercised enormous influence over territorial and early state governments. Water rights, mineral claims, grazing access, and timber concessions were allocated through processes that typically favored those with financial and political power rather than small operators or community interests. This transition from frontier to integrated region wasn't simply economic, but cultural. The rough-edged mining camp or cattle town gradually acquired institutions that signaled permanence and connection to wider society. Banks, schools, churches, newspapers, theaters, and fraternal organizations. Streets were surveyed, and sometimes paved. Wooden structures were replaced with brick and stone buildings. Local governments enacted ordinances regulating